Yes, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Jonathan Lay. I'm the founder of Make Time Count today. I'm just going to say a few words about us, then I'll hand over to our chair, Tim. So we were founded in 2020. We're a social enterprise dedicated to developing digital technologies that help society's most vulnerable. Social enterprise means that we're committed to dedicate 51% of our profits to a fund that will help those impacted by the criminal justice start their own businesses. So that's kind of the mission we're on. But fundamentally, we've developed a platform initially with probation, now working with various police forces around the country that tries to promote diversion. And we do that by trying to understand the root cause of people's behaviour. So by conducting a criminogenic needs assessment with them. And then to make it easier for agencies such as police forces, probation, prisons, to refer users to local community partners to create what we call a sort of a personal pit crew. So a number of agencies and even family members and friends that are supporting that particular individual to try and reduce reoffending. So that's in a nutshell who we are. And with that, I'll hand you over to Tim Godwin.
Thanks, Jonathan, and good afternoon, everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to be on this webinar call with you today. For those of you who don't know me, my background is that I was 31 years in the police. I retired as the Deputy Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, but in that period I'd spent some time as the Acting Commissioner during the riots. But importantly for this call, I spent 6 years as the lead for the Association of Chief Police Officers around Justice. And I was also one of the senior responsible officers for delivering what was in 2004, 2005 called the National Reassurance Project. And I'm now involved with Make Time Count as a non-exec chair, mainly because it was a bit of the missing link that we didn't have when we went down that path all those years ago. And I just want to share with you the history of all that, what we learned, what we did wrong, and how I see that some of the opportunities that are coming with this new government, but additionally with new technology that can actually impact on the offending patterns that we see across the country. So with that, if we go straight into it, the out of court resolutions and the next generation of neighbourhood policing is the title. But if we can go to the next slide, and I can then tell you a little bit about what we're going to be talking about. The first thing is the past, which was led by Tony Blair in response to challenges at the time. And that led to the National Reassurance Project, which was supervised by a bunch of pretty high profile academics who actually had control sites and actual pilot sites, so that we could actually gather the data to show that there were significant outcomes in the way that we delivered what was then known as safer neighbourhoods. Equally, a bit about the structure at the time with public service agreements, and then why neighbourhood policing, in my view, became the first casualty of austerity, and what we need to think about going forward in terms of neighbourhoods now, and how we can actually use the Goldstein problem-orientated policing methodology in terms of neighbourhood policing, and how that affects what we're going to talk about in terms of things like out-of-court resolutions. So if we can go straight into the past and into that next slide. The history at this point was I was the Assistant Commissioner for the territorial policing element of the Metropolitan Police. So basically I had 32 London boroughs, and the policing of those 32 London boroughs came within my command. And we had a series of, under the Tony Blair regime, we had a fairly hefty sort of performance requirement, which were called public service agreements. Public service agreements were things like, we're going to reduce gun crime by 30%, we're going to reduce knife crime by 25%, we're going to reduce robbery by 50%, we're going to reduce burglary. So it's the normal sort of targets you would see in a police service. And one of the elements of that was that I knew that actually no one had discussed it with the police, and that having been Commander Crime for a number of years before for London, I also recognised that, you know, we were going to let down whoever the civil servant was that owned that particular PSA, because we didn't have the capacity and the capability to actually impact on those targets. But there was a big push to put those assets into those public service agreement targets, because the way the government looked at it was they were targets that had been set as you would with any other contractor. We're going to give you this amount of money as your budget, and this is what we want you to deliver for us. The only bit that was different is we didn't cost out what they wanted us to achieve. Outcome of that was we had gun crime going down, we had knife crime going down, we had robbery going down, we had a whole range of those targets making progress towards the outcomes that were sought. But at the very same time, we had fear of crime, satisfaction in the police, and trust and confidence in the police going the opposite direction. So confidence in us was falling, confidence in us in our ability to keep people safe, and people were feeling less safe. And that's because in a large number of areas, gun crime is not actually a significant issue. Likewise, robbery, likewise, burglary. And it was more about antisocial behaviour. It was more about antisocial driving of vehicles that were putting children at risk. It was the neighbours from hell that could never be contained or controlled. And it was those things that actually upset people more. Antisocial behaviour, drunkenness, racism, misogynistic graffiti, racist graffiti. And as a result of that, we had to respond. The outcome of that was that we set up a thing called the National Reassurance Project. It was kicked off by the then Prime Minister, Tony Blair, and what he wanted us to do, and it was predominantly myself and Sir Dennis O'Connor, what we wanted to do was to actually look at how we could develop neighbourhood policing in order to respond to this challenge, which was to actually respond to the actual needs of communities within London and elsewhere. To do that, we actually introduced a new player, which was a police community support officer. So we wrote the job description of a police community support officer, because police officers at that point culturally were still driven to respond to calls. They were very driven in terms of hunting for criminals, which is a good thing. You don't particularly want to turn police off that. But at the same time, we needed them to be present in communities, talking to communities about what the problems were that they were having to respond to and live through, and what their priorities would be for their neighbourhood. And so a police community support officer who's freed up from having to do those things that police officers have got in their arsenal, they became very critical in the rollout of safer neighbourhoods. We had in London a neighbourhood team on every ward in London, and it was a minimum of a sergeant, 2 constables, and 3 police community support officers. And the government provided the money for the police community support officers, and we had to find the 2 constables and the sergeant. The reality of being able to replicate that today, you're not going to. The cuts that have gone into police budgets means that that is going to be far harder to have that resource capacity. We did identify from the studies, though, that significant outcomes in terms of more than 2 standard deviations above the mean were achieved in terms of trust and confidence, in terms of satisfaction and feeling of security in all the sites that we tested first before the full rollout occurred for the National Reassurance Project. And that was quite reassuring. And we used new measures. We used new measures such as footfall after a certain time at night on the local parade of shops. How many people were sitting on the top deck of buses after 10 o'clock at night? And these things were all indicators, proxy indicators of people feeling safer, together with the stuff that we were doing with the academic studies in terms of the controls. So fear of crime had gone out of control in the sense it bore no relation to the reality of crime. And as a result of that, we needed to start having that dialogue and conversation with citizens and local people to actually say, this is the reality of what's occurring. What is it from your perspective? What can we do? And how can you hold us to account? At the time, we were tackling knife crime, various others, and we were able to explain using the neighbourhood teams how we could, what we were going to use the powers such as Section 60s, stop search and other stop and search powers, and that this was about keeping people safe, not actually targeting specific minority groups, etc. And we were making ourselves accountable through those neighbourhood teams who would call on a leadership officer to go down and explain it if there was some tension there that we needed to address. And as a result, we started to develop on that, and we built a new thing called diamond districts. Now, diamond districts is it's a Met in here. I've noticed the names. Diamond district in the Met in those days, everything had to have something that was a gem. So if you did anything, it was a sapphire or an opal or in this case a diamond district. And what that was looking at super output estates where we've got high numbers of offenders who are persistent offenders, often short sentence prisoners who had the highest recidivism rates because they led chaotic lifestyles and they were actually the ones that needed the greatest help. But because they were that low level offender that just keeps coming to notice, they didn't get into sort of the MAPA regimes, and they didn't get into some of the integrated offender management regimes that we had in place. And so we wanted to do that for them. And we used neighbourhood teams working with probation officers, working with mental health nurses, and working with social services to see what we could do about creating for them a package so that we met them while they're in prison, and then we helped them when they came out to get accommodation, jobs, if necessary, addiction, support for substance misuse, etc., etc., etc. We were told that they wouldn't like the police, the offenders, that they wouldn't want anything to do with us, and it was a voluntary basis. And what we actually found is 90% of them actually trusted the police a lot. And the reason for that is that generally they'd found that the police would actually do what they said they would do, whereas some others, agencies that they dealt with hadn't. And as a result of that, we also had conversations with their significant others, their families, their loved ones, and it was a different conversation to normal. When you're going around to arrest them, it's actually how can we help keep Fred out of going back to prison, and how can we support you in helping him to not go back to prison. And it changed the dynamic between that population on our neighbourhoods and the police. And I remember talking to one of our police constables in South London, and I said, what's it changed for you on this estate? And he said, well, instead of them wanting to throw a microwave at me as they did last time from the roof, they're actually saying hello, because we'd changed the posture of the police. We were there to help, not just to arrest. Of course, we have to arrest in certain occasions, but there were a number of occasions when you could do something differently, and it's that doing something differently that once again is becoming rather important in terms of current situation of criminal justice and policing. Diamond districts worked very well initially, but because it was very labour intensive again, and we didn't have enough places to refer individuals to, it was very hard to maintain that against controls. What we actually had is that the harm index fell significantly in terms of types of criminality that were occurring, but there was still criminality later down the path. And as a result of that, it was felt that actually from certain political leaders, and I shall name them, felt that actually it was cheaper to send them to prison. And so that one was turned off. But I think there's an opportunity to revisit that thinking. And I know Amy Rees, the Director General of His Majesty's Prisons and Probation Service, is also of that mind, as she was the Brixton Governor when we were doing the Diamond Districts. And there's a lot of merit in police and HMPPS working very closely together, because between us, we can actually have an impact. If we go to the next one, Ellie. Now, the biggest upset to me was I retired January 2012 after the riots, and austerity was then kicking in. And we had a number of studies that had been done by sort of individuals that you could take £1 billion out of the police and they wouldn't notice the difference. And a few of us argued at that time that that was absolutely nonsense, because something would have to go. And the actual reality came down to, what do you think the police should do? And it changed from being how safe do you feel, how confident are you in your neighbourhood that you're going to be safe, how reassured are you that that the police actually know what's going on and therefore are doing stuff to make your quality of life better in your neighbourhood as well? To one of how many burglars have you caught? How many people have you convicted? And how quickly did you convict them? And response times, etc. And actually that other side, the reassurance side and community policing side, was seen as something that wasn't delivering against those metrics and therefore was moved away as part of the cuts. Because the currency of the police has always been police numbers, every politician says, oh, we're going to increase it by X thousand. But that actually means we lose a lot of really, really good police staff in that process. And actually, one of the casualties was the number of police community support officers who were then not repopulated posts. So a number of redundancies as well as a number of lost through leaving. And the PCSOs were absolutely critical in our success because they were the ones who had the better relationship with neighbourhoods than the police officer did, because they were there more often, they were more visible and more familiar, and as a result were actually doing a fine job. Many of us did argue that the policing's far more than that, and but it was falling on deaf ears against a specific political ambition. I then got involved. I moved on to work for a company called Accenture initially. I'm sort of semi-retired now, but with Accenture, I got involved in the Black Lives Matter events in America to support the police populations and the police leadership in the US. And one of the things that struck me was a piece of work by Professor Sparrow from Harvard, who actually was trying to have a look at where did all this, what was the genesis of this total breakdown in relationship between sections of the community and their local police. And one of the reasons that he came up with, which I could see from what we'd been doing in the UK, was that there was this emphasis on a thing called CompStat, which is a performance focus about arresting people, convicting people, especially for low-level crime, which is the debate we've just been having about, retail crime, antisocial behaviour, etc. And what that means is that you over-police certain areas, and as a result of that, you lose consent, and you have to be more coercive to make that happen, and then you lose consent even more. And if we're not careful, we could well be in that cycle ourselves if we're not already there in some areas. So the time now is to actually reflect on that and then think about where we're going to go from now. We still need to tackle antisocial behaviour. We still need to tackle retail crime. We do need to arrest offenders for those sorts of crimes that need arresting and going to court. But there must be alternatives. Our prisons are full. Talking to Amy, it's a massive challenge. And at this moment in time, there's going to be early releases. If we get the decisions wrong about those early releases, their mapper's going to get overwhelmed. And as a result of that, it's incumbent that we actually start reflecting on what does this government mean about neighbourhood policing, and what do they actually want from neighbourhood policing? And at the same time, how can that be used to shut the pipe down of all the cases that are going through the courts? So with that in mind, we had a look at all the different cases that are currently being charged and what the outcomes are, and whether actually they needed to go to court at all. And I was on the sentencing council for a number of years with Brian Leveson and with Sir Keir Starmer, the now Prime Minister. And one of the things that there are that is used in the courts is actually the sentencing guidance has to be used to actually assess what that penalty will be. And one of the things that we did was use the sentencing guidance to actually test some cases in London, supported by Katie Harbour in London. And we also tested it with some of the data that we can get from the MOJ, etc. And what we found is that a significant number of cases that go to court, especially into magistrates' court, but not just magistrates' court, actually end up in a fine, a conditional discharge, absolute discharge, or some form of low-level community penalty. Well, all those things can be issued in a conditional caution. And if the legislation goes forward as planned, you're going to have even more powers in terms of deferred prosecutions such that it means that you don't actually need to put it to the court. Now, if anyone Googled me, you'll see I had a little bit of a difference of opinion as the Justice Lead for the police with the then Tony Blair government, who wanted to march them to the cash point. I don't know if you remember that, but they wanted them to be instantly fined in terms of antisocial behaviour, take them to the cash point, take a fine off them. My experience of police officers and money and potential allegations and all the rest of it means that that is just not what the police do. And as a result of that, I was opposed to the widening of the penalty notices in that fashion for criminal offences. What is different though around the out of court resolutions is you're not actually giving a penalty as such, because they can actually accept it or not. And as a result of that, the decision, if they want to plead not guilty, is for a magistrate or a judge, which is much more appropriate than a police officer. So as a result of that, out of court resolutions that we have now, and especially with the new legislation, may well be that bit of march them to the cash point. So as a result, you know, I've been looking at with Make Time Count and Peter Neighbourhood at Cambridge, how that can actually now be used as a tool for moving forward in terms of revisiting the neighbourhood policing offer that we give to communities. If you go to the next one, Ellie, which is today, how digital makes a difference. Now, when I first bumped into Make Time Count and the work they were doing around out of court resolutions, and the very good work that had gone on in Kent, in Thames Valley, is more recently moving through it with victims, but equally in terms of the Met, in terms of its turning point, etc. One of the things that I found is that it's a very streamlined process. With me, in the National Reassurance Project days and the safer neighbourhoods, and in terms of the diamond districts, it was all based on labour intensive, and it was about using old systems in terms of uploading case files, etc. Come to today, and it's bears no relation technology wise in the sense of the opportunity of digital. And Accenture, where I worked, is a big digital company, and they carry out AI and generative AI, and you can automate so much to help officers make good decisions. And as a result of that, by actually doing this, you can actually identify whether they're eligible for an out of court. You can also identify whether they are going to get more if they go to court or not in terms of the sentencing guidance, which gives an officer an opportunity to discuss it with a victim to get them involved in the decision-making process. But it's almost immediate justice. And as a result of that, you can then refer them on to mentoring schemes, to whatever comes out of their needs assessment. And then looking through that, that would have been a fantastic thing to have had in the hands of my neighbourhood officers when I was in the Met, and equally in terms of diamond districts, because you can then plot what's happening to individuals. You can keep track of whether they're attending their meetings. You can get feedback from probation if it's there, or if it's a mentoring scheme, that get feedback on their progress. And if they don't engage fully with it, you could then, using the deferred prosecution legislation that's on its way, you can then send them back to court. Police officers, I found, initially found neighbourhood policing not proper policing. It was very hard to convince them that actually it is. Once they were fully engaged, though, in the Safer Neighbourhoods programs, they didn't want to come off because they felt they were making a difference, and they were getting a great deal of satisfaction about working with communities to problem solve. And as a result of that, they were progressing to sergeants and working equally very closely with PCSOs, who initially were viewed by the police with some cynicism, I would say, which is probably the wrong term, but they were not, probably skepticism would have been more appropriate. So a bit of skepticism there. And they had to win over their police colleagues, but in the vast majority of those that we recruited, they did. And I think under this government, you're going to start seeing that coming again. But what you then find when you are diverting and when you are doing this is you need somewhere to refer them. You need to put those conditions. So if they need numeracy, literacy training, if they need addiction treatment help and support, if they need a mentor. It is actually very difficult now to see how that capacity can be done through state agencies. And as a result, we're going to have to look at how we can mobilize communities and how we're going to make good use of those community volunteer groups who have those skills that can actually get involved. And that's going to need a push on the ground. So there's Band of Brothers in London. There's a whole heap of opportunities there, and then you can create some. In London, I set up with the Premier League Kicks, which is now does Kicks, it does Aspire, there's a whole program, and it's delivered through 50, 60 odd clubs, so not just the Premier League clubs, and they provide those targeted interventions in those communities. Now, one of the things that we decided when we first launched it was that we, as the police, would tell the Premier League where to take their programs and get the youngsters involved. And we would look at the cohort we wanted to talk to. And we would use that environment, which was a positive, fun environment. And the Premier League brand and the football club brand was actually quite appealing to the group that we were seeking to engage with. And police officers attended those and actually got to know the young people who were at the cusp of potentially offending, who came along there. They were about 50% of the attending group, and they would get to know them in a non-hostile environment, such it made it far easier to have a relationship with them outside of the kicks arrangements. So if there are other ideas, they're the things that can be done through the third sector. And certainly I'm now the chairman of the Premier League charity, and which they kindly asked me to do. And one of the things that the Premier League are looking at is how they can support you going forward in terms of reintroducing that neighbourhood policing style, reintroducing better use of diversion, out of court resolutions, and how they can support that. The Premier League has a lot of facilities, and the charity that we have at the moment is 36 million a year. So it is significant investment, and they need to work with you closely to actually work out how we can support this opportunity. But we won't be alone in that. There'll be a number of other charities that want to get involved, and if we can shape that referral cohort, that ecosystem that you can use to divert people to, then all the better, because as a result, you're set up to succeed, not set up to fail. They weren't in place when we went through with it last time. If we can march on to the next one, conscious of the time, offender management, neighbour policing. I'm sure most of the people on this call will be aware of problem-orientated policing. All right, it's been going since the 60s. Professor Herman Goldstein and I remember reading about it in my very early police career, and one of the things was that it was very logical. If you can identify who the offenders are or likely to be offenders and reduce the number of them and their activity, you're going to reduce crime. If you reduce the number of victims that are vulnerable through target hardening and guidance, etc., by changing the environment, you're going to reduce crime. If you reduce the number of offenders and reduce the number of victims, then you're going to reduce crime. And so as a result of that, neighbour policing has always been in that emphasis of that problem solving. Who are the offenders? Who are the victims? Who are the likely victims? Who are the likely offenders? And how can we stop them being victims or offenders? And that's where now, with the push against antisocial behaviour, with the push against things like retail crime, at the moment, if we don't change, then we're just going to clog up that backlog even more. Whereas if we have in place a robust methodology and policy and ecosystem to actually divert people away from court, but at the same time, if they fail, use the deferred prosecution later to bring them back in so that it's not seen as an easy way out, and to track their progress so that you can inform the victim, yes, they did all this mentoring, yes, they've done this numeracy, literacy, etc., etc., then you're actually going to restore some public confidence, but equally you're going to change the perception of the police working in those communities where they have high offender populations. And so it's not rocket science, but it's difficult to deliver if you don't think about how many people you're going to need, and how are you going to be able to deliver it with that ecosystem. The only way, therefore, is to actually use a digital platform, whether it's Make Time Count or another, and I'm sure there are others, but it's about using that digital platform to be able to connect up the referring agencies with the individual and the police officer that's going to oversee it and the probation officer that's going to oversee it. It's about building strong relationships with HMPPS and probation. And it's more than just low-level offending. It's people, that are released on short-term licenses, temporary licenses. It's about offenders that have come out after a short sentence, and as a result of that, going to need some help with the early release schemes. Many of you will know this better than I. Some people find out sort of a couple of days before they're released, they've got nothing in place as to where to live, job, anything. And as a result, we need to start mobilizing ourselves to work effectively together as partners in terms of actually dealing with that. I use the term, I want to see offender management, local offender management, sort of baked into the role of neighbourhood policing, because that's what it always was. And that's the bit that we should know who they are. We should try to support them changing their lifestyle. We should also pull them up when they do wrong, but at the same time maintain relationships with their families and others, so that we can actually do the best we can to tackle things like getting dragged into gangs, etc. The other bit that we're going to have a challenge on is, I think we've gone back to the days where people see it as a bit soft. Cautions, conditional cautions, diversion. It's a bit soft. Let's just lock them all up. And the reality of that, of course, is it's not feasible to do that. What we need to therefore do is to actually start making that case, showing that it's not soft, and actually it is appropriate. And if you look at the sentencing guidance, it's very appropriate. At this point, I'm going to shut up because I've been prattling on and it's 35 minutes, and take any questions at this point.
There's a couple come through on the Q&A, so I will just run through those for you if that's helpful.
Missed those.
Yeah, okay. I mean, some of them are almost been answered by you, but probably best to go over again. So, what safeguards are in place to prevent OoCRs from becoming a soft option for offenders?
Sorry, can you say that again?
What safeguards are in place to prevent OoCRs from becoming a soft option for offenders?
I think the biggest safeguard is, and I think that the government are currently looking to make sure that that occurs, which is deferred prosecution. So in other words, if they don't fulfill their commitments under those conditions that you might employ under a conditional caution, then they go to court. And equally, it's about tracking them. It was interesting talking to some police services, I won't name them, who didn't actually know what their compliance rate was for the conditional cautions they currently give. And so for that, you do need that digital tracking, that digital performance indicator, and you do need that dashboard which you get from a digital platform such as Make Time Count. So in other words, you can track the interventions, you can track whether it's working, has that person come to light again, have they got a second OoCR, in which case does that take them into a prosecution phase. I'm confident that if you actually keep on the case, then people will be more compliant than you think. And I think the other bit is that, for example, it's about supporting people like probation, because people used to think community sentences were a soft option, and people didn't bother to do their unpaid work. And as a result of that, they get a recall, or they'll get challenged first, second challenge, then they go back to court, and then they get 20 days, 30 days in custody. When we had the Diamond Districts, a PCSO would go and knock on the door to remind them where they should be at 7:30 the following morning, and we went up to a 90% compliance rate for community sentences. So I think it's about tracking it, it's about monitoring it, it's about responding to what the data tells you, and all that. For that, you do need to have it all on digital platforms. Hope that answered that. If not,
yeah, I think so. It also answered another question we had comes through about data analytics and how that can help improve outcomes. So that was a great answer. Thank you, Tim.
In terms of data analytics, the other bit that we can do if you do track it is, everyone's got good ideas, but do they actually work? and what is the best idea for a referral for a certain type of offender. Yeah. Now with AI and Gen AI, you can actually start tracking all that through that data, and then that can tell you what's more likely to have a result than others. So AI can inform you as to the sorts of schemes that would suit that person to go to. So by doing this, you will get a lot more data about what works and what doesn't.
Excellent.
There's a hand up.
Yes, there's a couple of questions in here though. Tracy, if you can put your question or discussion point in the Q&A and or chat, that would be great. If not, we can come back to you at the end of the session as well. So I've got a couple of discussion points and questions here now as well that have just come through. So what are your thoughts on immediate justice as an out-of-court disposal for ASB related crime?
Yes. I think antisocial behaviour depends what it is. And again, that comes into the nature of anyone hurt, et cetera, which you do through the needs assessment and the two-tier framework that you go through to make a decision. But I do think antisocial behaviour, and there's so much of it apparently, what we're going to have to do is to actually use these out-of-court disposals. But again, you've got to track them, you've got to make sure they comply with them, and you've got to deal with them if they don't. And you need to get their families involved in that. And you actually need to make sure there's the right places to refer them to, which are going to motivate them. And so I do think it's the only way of dealing with the volumes you've got. Excellent.
Okay, I've got one more question here, which is more a discussion point rather than a question, but interesting to hear your thoughts. So someone's recently had conversations with frontline officers around OoCRs in response to the prison capacity issue. Some of them believe that we're acting in a quasi-judicial role through their use, and that we should be sending all cases to court regardless of the lack of capacity or proportionality in doing so. Winning over those beliefs, despite the evidence base and benefits to the wider criminal justice system, is a challenge.
Yes, and that's all about, as everyone on this call I'm sure will know, it's about leadership, but it's also about proving it. It's about making sure that you can actually show, whoops, slight hiccup there, that you can actually show what's occurring. You are going to have to win them over, as we had to with the safer neighbourhoods, etc. But actually, once you've given them the tools so they can see what's happening, then that'll be good. I mean, in my head, which isn't the way it's run in Kent, and it's not the way it's run in the Met at present, would be, you know, that a police officer, a response officer, or any police officer can actually deal with someone with antisocial behaviour or theft, retail theft, or whatever, and can actually go through the needs assessments, work out whether they fit or not, go through the two-tier, and they'll say, yep, you're eligible for an out-of-court resolution. Ping that over from their postcode to the local neighbourhood officers or PCSOs, who can then go around and do the needs assessment with the family, etc., get to know the individual, and then from that work it through in terms of referrals locally to where that person lives, because often they're committing offences not where they live. So I think it's about showing them that it works, and don't expect a massive success on day one, because you have to keep chipping away. Also make it humorous, and make it, you know, show them that they're making a difference, because they will be making a difference. And when you see victim satisfaction coming up, because you'll be talking to the victims about it, you can compare it against sentencing guidance, and it's not so much about the prison populations going up in that sense. The bit that we need for the prison populations is the reoffenders that come out, often short sentence prisoners, who go back a bit quick, which is again using sort of integrated offender management, but at that lower level with the same sort of referrals. So you can hit on two key themes: victim trust and confidence, victim satisfaction, and reducing court numbers. So the cases like sex offenders and all the rest of it can go to court a lot quicker. Magistrates' courts can be turned into Crown courts. You just need a judge to sit there. So there's lots of things that you can do if you take out that hit. You also need people on the ground, and actually you free up police officers significantly from case files going to court, etc., if you use out-of-court disposals. But it's about using it consistently, and that's where the digital platforms help. That was long-winded. I'm sorry.
To be honest, I think within that process, you've answered Simon's question in the chat as well. Please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, Simon, but I think that covered that point as well. But we can always follow up via email with all of you if you have any extra questions. We'll just end on one more, which has come through on the chat. It's from Colin. Do you think restorative justice should be influencing OOCRs?
Right, restorative justice is an interesting one. In London, when I was there, we ran the biggest longitudinal study in restorative justice, and it was reviewed by Betsy Stanko and Larry Sherman. Now, from Betsy's perspective, it didn't have a better outcome than other opportunities in terms of disposal. But Larry would say the harm index came down greatly. In some, you've got to do it for the right people. It's not fit for everyone, and it's very expensive. And so I think there is a definite place for restorative justice. But equally, learning from New South Wales, where it all started, you have to be quite careful as to which ones you put through that process and which ones you revert to other things. It's about learning what's right for the individuals. But restorative justice could definitely have a part to play, but it isn't the overall offer. OOCRs, again, in terms of that, I think if you refer people to other groups, they can get motivated just by the fact that they're local. I think half the problem is they're state agencies or whatever, and it becomes a process rather than it's a community thing. It's a intervention Premier League kicks, the local team. It's a whole range of different things, and I think we need to localize it to actually overcome that soft option bit where people aren't tracked and aren't aren't keeping an eye on.
Definitely. I think we could squeeze one more question in before we move on. There's one last question from Sandra. So a great deal of local policing involves dealing with the homeless and others in a state of destitution. How will this help to shift this mentality, if at all?
I think the community problem solving that we did before, a lot of it was rough sleepers. It was people with alcohol and substance misuse challenges, sleeping in parks, making it a rather fearful place for children to actually play with parents. And they've always been there. Now, that may lead to things like setting up wet centres and dry centres, working with social services and to try and actually get them through some addiction treatment processes to take them out of that arrangement. The one thing we found is that a lot of homeless people that we dealt with in that period, because of their addiction, did not want to go to a hostel where they're not allowed alcohol or drugs. And as a result of that, we did have wet centres set up in those areas of need, and then they would transfer them over to dry centres where they had more things to have fun with and to use. So it was quite a stark difference between the wet and dry facilities that were there. Again, that's investment, that's more cost. But for that, we've got to identify how we can save productivity and other things to actually build the capability around that. But yes, it will deal. You will have places to refer them to. And I think the other bit, I think as a police officer, I probably didn't know how many charities were at work in some of those locations. And this is a great way of getting to know as to who's there to help whomever. And so you can actually identify the best routes for them. There will always be some that you won't be able to do, but if you minimize the number, you make a difference.
Amazing. I think we'll leave it there with the questions, but if anyone has any specifics for Tim, feel free to drop me an email after this session. I'll pop my email in the chat and then we can follow up. Now, Tim, Jonathan's still on a call, so if you wanted to take us through the make time count,
yep,
that would be fab. Yeah.
Just briefly in terms of, if you go to the next one, then just to tell you what the platform could look like. As I say, this isn't a sales pitch for Make Time Count. It's to make you aware of it, but there may be others out there. We haven't found anything as good or a social enterprise. But if we could, because the one thing Make Time Count wants to do is to invest in those communities where actually the tool's being used. So to support having those referral places to go to and to put the profit into that. But if we go into the next slide. So there we go. It's a social enterprise, and it's to help transform criminal justice. And at the moment, it is creaking. I think most people would agree with that. And what we need to do is to do some radical surgery on it, and this is a way of doing it. If we moved just to neighbourhood policing and to out-of-court resolutions or deferred prosecutions, as is in the Act, one of the challenges will be actually being able to do it, because the sorts of volumes that you're going to come across in terms of antisocial behaviour, retail crime, low-level assaults, etc., might even be used in a low-level incident of domestic abuse that needs slapping down on pretty quick. Then in which case you're going to have huge volumes to deal with. So the first thing we need to do is to enable officers to keep track, to make it as user-friendly as possible and as instinctive as possible, and to take them through the necessary consideration factors based on the policy of the force, but equally the legislation, and then to support those that are tasked with doing the needs assessments to go through that process and come up with what their needs are, and then come up with their referral plans. So the platform is ISO, it's secure, it's being used in Kent, still being developed, and as always with the police and with probation services, they're always adding to it to make it even more efficient and more effective. And so it's still in development, but it does empower the justice agencies to work more effectively together, and equally for the police to make consistent judgments and to increase the use of out-of-court resolutions, because they're not going to get any different when they go to court. What's the next one? And Jonathan, I know, will be absolutely mortified he's not here. So it's got 3 stages. It actually goes through the platform supporting the original, supports the original decision making. So it will take you through the key policies, etc., 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 and it'll take you out and it'll prompt you with questions, and then the yes/no type questions that you'll be able to put in, and then it will look at whether that person fits within your policy as a police force to give an out-of-court resolution. If it says could consider charge, then you can test it against sentencing guidance to see if actually they're actually going to get much extra if they went to court anyway. And it's not you being a judicial process. It is not you giving a conviction. It's just giving you some information on what was likely, because what you're doing is offering them an out-of-court resolution to which they can say no to, in which case they go to court. But it's not a quasi-judicial process, but it is using the things that are out there to inform your decision making, which police service has always been about. You've always had the ability, police discretion as to whether you're going to arrest a person or not. If you think it's necessary to do so, you will. If you don't, you won't. You'll take a different approach. And this is no different to that. It's just giving you more information to defend your judgment, and at the same time to have a discussion with the victim as to why you've done certain things. The analytics that we're now starting to talk about with the AI is to look at, what's the risk of an individual reoffending based on data? What is the best program that's most likely to achieve success with that individual, and what can we learn from the cohorts that we currently got going through it? It is a tool that's is built to enable multi-agency collaboration. So if you've referred an individual to 3 agencies or 4 agencies, that collaboration can take place on the platform, as well as the collaborate. So between those different agencies and you, and a lot of them are third sector. And so you basically, Jonathan uses the term, you create a personal pit crew who are all going to be looking after you as an individual that's going through the process to make sure that you turn out at the end the way it was meant to be. Most of our calculations at the moment, we work on a 70%. In terms of business cases, we work on a 70% compliance rate, and 30% would therefore end up in the new legislation becoming a deferred prosecution, and therefore that's costed back into the court. But we are actually hoping that we'll get higher than that. We took a fairly pessimistic view of it, just because a lot of police officers will say they're just not going to do it. Well, let's test that. It's actually the booking for the interventions is fairly straightforward. They describe it on this slide as Airbnb, so it's actually very easy to use, and at the same time you can actually get tracks back in terms of how that's going. And we can actually digitally track, as I mentioned many times, digitally track what's going on, who's doing what, who's using the app. So we can show its use, but equally we can show the compliance or otherwise of the various options that are put in terms of the following needs assessment in terms of the intervention plan. Next one. Yes, so danger of repeating myself. It's a multi-agency platform. You can get 360 feedback, and it's user driven. So if you need things changed through your command in terms of whoever's in charge of your CJ process and your out of court resolution process, and hopefully with the new legislation making it more efficient, then it's going to be able to give you all that data so that you can actually track what's going on, but actually produce it on a Power BI or whatever, so you can actually show whether it's working or not. And at that point, never been a good salesman. Sorry about that.
No, that's perfect. I was just about to say, I think, unless there's any other questions, we could probably call it a day here. There's a couple of questions we didn't get through, if you wanted to have a look.
Right, let's go to the questions.
Lovely. Okay, let me just grab those out. Quick question from Julia about the slides. Absolutely, we can share those slides with you, Julia. We'll send those out and the recording to all attendees, so you'll get that within the next couple of days. Let me just scroll down here. There's lots of questions coming through, Tim, which is great. Here's a good one. So, drawing on your experience, what are some practical steps police forces can take to build trust and improve relationships with the community they serve?
It sounds trite, but talk to them and explain what we're doing. I remember, when I first went to London as a command of crime to sort of work with the homicide teams initially, following the Macpherson inquiry. And the Met did some amazing stuff in terms of community panels. It had a lay panel that was monitoring the performance of homicide, changed the way it did homicide, reached out to different communities to explain why they were doing certain things and why not. And it had a massive impact with the implementation of police crime commissioners, and in the case of London MOPAC, a lot of those meetings were deferred to the politicians as opposed to the police themselves. And so as a result of that, it is about getting on the ground and talking to the key individuals out there in those communities to find out what's happening. It's about explaining ourselves. And, for the knife crime response that we set up, we'd have difficulty doing it now because a lot of it was using knife arches and wands on the street. But we were telling people why we were there and that we wanted to actually deny the public space to those that were carrying weapons, and people were actually okay. I had one lady when I was did Sky News, and I went into a pub with the Crown Prosecution Service. Oh, of course I don't go in the pub a lot, but the CPS, and she came up to me and she went, "You're him, and I said, "Yeah, but look, the stop and search is not about." Sort of taking an opportunity to harass certain members of the community, such as young black men or whatever. It's not about that. It's just we got to operate in those areas where people are getting stabbed. And she said, "You don't have to tell me that. I check my kids' bags before they go to school. I check my kids' bags when they come back from school. No, my question is, why is it taking you so long?" Because we make assumptions of how people feel, but everybody in neighbourhoods wants to keep their kids safe. There's very few that don't, and as a result, it's about getting out there, talking to people, you're going to get, I think, a government under Keir Starmer with Yvette Cooper, who's going to be very positive about reintroducing neighbourhood policing, PCSOs, and giving you the tools that you need, and to stimulate people like the Premier League to support you as well as other charities. And that will change the posture. When you're there to help, it changes it to be that you're there as an army of occupation. And I think that's where, in some places, not all, we could be viewed. And I think that's why I think it was forced on through austerity. So I'm not blaming anyone about that. But I think what we need to do is get that back.
Awesome. I think we'll end this session with a positive news story from Tracy, who popped in as a discussion. She said, I just wanted to say to any skeptics that may be out there, I work with women who are at risk or in the criminal justice system. We have clients that have been referred to us via OoCRs on a conditional caution, and I can honestly say this has been highly successful. They go on to continue with the support after their caution has ended, and their reoffending has ceased in 90% of these cases. I think that's a nice positive
Brilliant
note to end on.
Well done, Tracy. That's what we need. Well done.
Awesome. Okay, I think we'll call it there and give everyone 2 minutes back. But thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you so much, Tim, for giving your time and chatting to everyone.
Been a total pleasure.